Good morning, everybody. My name is Ryan Turnbull, and I'm here today from the Anglican Diocese of Rupert's Land. I met Matt a few months ago at an event I hosted at St. John's College, which is where I work. So I work for our bishop. My formal title is the Diocesan Discipleship Developer, which is a bit of a mouthful. But essentially, I just kind of oversee all sorts of theological education stuff for every level of our diocese. So people training for ordained ministry, workshops for lay people. This past week, we just did a 3-day discipleship camp with a group of priests and lay people at the college. So I mostly just get to have fun and make stuff up and come on the weekends and preach at churches. So I'm really delighted to be here. I think my friend Rob Dean preaches here on occasion, is that right? So I go back with him quite a long ways, and I've heard a lot about you guys, so I'm very excited to be here. When I was asked to preach, they said, what do you want to preach on? I said, well, I don't know. I usually just preach on whatever the Old Testament lectionary reading is, and I didn't really look at what that was. So it's 2 Samuel chapter 5, and we're going to try and land there. But I think to understand what's going on in this passage, we're going to have to do a bit of a speed run through the entire book of Samuel, and I promise to keep this relatively short. God's promise to God's people, his covenant relationship, is bound up in this simple phrase: I will be your God, and you will be my people. This is an incredible commitment to persist in faithfulness to Israel, even though, if you know your Bibles at all, you will know that Israel is not very good at being faithful to God. Nevertheless, God has committed that I will be your God, and you will be my people. And I think this basic affirmation that we find all through the law is really our key for understanding what's going on through the book of Samuel. The book of Samuel tends to read as if it's history. And some biblical scholars will even refer to it as the part of the Deuteronomistic history. But it's important to remember that Samuel is prophetic literature. It's not historiography. And this is really important, I think, because we have a tendency to read Samuel as if it's kind of reporting on historical happenings and perhaps trying to teach us something through the kind of reporting of Israel's history. But if we don't realize the kind of prophetic directionality to this text, we're going to miss some key ironic moments, some key kind of between the lines messages that are really important for understanding why it is that this book that actually doesn't have a lot to do about Samuel, particularly in its second half, is named after this prophet. So the book of Samuel is kind of structured around this question of kingship. Should Israel have a king or not? And if they're going to have a king, who is this king going to be? Now, this is a question that the book of Samuel inherits from the book of Judges, right? What's the refrain in the book of Judges? Yeah, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. Over and over again in the book of Judges, you'll see a charismatic leader be brought up, save Israel from whatever kind of mess they've gotten themselves into, and then that judge dies. The people do not teach their children about what God has done for them, and a new generation arises that neither knows God nor fears him. And over, this spiral kind of continues, and the kind of narrator in the background is saying, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. So by the time we get to the start of the book of Samuel, we're primed for this question of, okay, finally here we've arrived. We're going to perhaps finally get this answer to this problem that Judges has given us. Where is the king? Who is this king going to be? And in the opening pages of Judges, we get this interesting character, Eli, who's kind of one of the last of the judges. right? He's a priest, but he also judges the people. And reading between the lines a little bit, it seems like he's kind of set himself up as a king, right? He's located himself quite closely to the center of cultic activity, which at this point is at Shiloh. And he's kind of calling the shots from there, reigning as if he has a court. And his sons are starting, it seems like what's starting to happen, he's trying to establish a dynasty. And his sons are starting to kind of rule in his stead. But they are wicked and awful and unjust. And the people cry out against them. And this all kind of culminates in these sons taking the Ark of the Covenant out of the cultic area at Shiloh to go wage war against the Philistines. And they lose the Ark of the Covenant, right? They're defeated by the Philistines. They lose the Ark. They die. It's a horrible mess. And Eli and his sons are kind of humiliated. Meanwhile, though, Samuel is kind of in the mix. He's just this boy working at the temple. His parents have dropped him off there. And he hears God calling him. And God telling him that he's going to be the one to replace Eli. So Eli kind of takes this on the chin and is like, well, I mean, if God said it, I guess that's how it's going to be. And so Samuel grows in power and in prestige around the people of Israel. And eventually he kind of comes to replace Eli, functioning as this quasi-head of state. He's referred to always as this kind of prophet or holy man or judge, but he does do things that a king would do. He leads the people in battle. He is associated with the sacrifice in this kind of priestly function. And he actually ends up moving the center of cultic and political authority from Shiloh to Ramah, his hometown. So he establishes a new capital. These are the kinds of things that kings do. Samuel, again, you get the exact same kind of story unfolding with Samuel that you saw with Eli. His sons grow up, and like all through the book of Judges, they don't really know God, they don't fear God, they're wicked, they're evil, and the people kind of say, enough of this. We want a king. We want a proper king who's going to do kingship right. And Samuel is, of course, horribly offended by this. God says, no, don't worry. They're not actually rejecting you. They're rejecting me. Because up until this point, they have not had strong kings in the way of kings. Kings being those who lead in battle and provide a sense of security for the people of Israel. God is the one who fights on their behalf, right? All the way back to the beginning of Israel's life as the people of God, God has been the one who fights on their behalf, who goes after the Egyptians, who goes after the Ammonites, who goes after all those who stand in Israel's path and delivers them from them. However, as much as this is the kind of the theological thing that the scriptures want to say about what God has done for the people of Israel, every so often you get these little glimpses into what the actual political economy of Israel was, and they're kind of constantly dominated by the people around them. Even into the time of the reign of Saul, who is supposedly this king who's supposed to solve this problem, who's going to take the fight to the enemy. Well, we get wind that the Philistines have, in fact, issued a decree that nobody in Israel can be a blacksmith because they're worried that they're going to start building weapons, right? Well, what kind of king oversees a kingdom that isn't even allowed to have blacksmiths, right? Like, they're clearly kind of under the thumb of the nations that are around them. So Saul is portrayed as this kind of answer to this question, but he doesn't really want the job. He's not actually very good at wielding power, and he has kind of mixed success in battle. And when things start going wrong, he kind of runs back to the previous king, right? He's running back to Samuel all the time for reassurance. And Samuel is kind of like, think of the position that this puts Samuel in, right? Like, he's the one who's kind of legitimized Saul and was like, you know, like I tried this, didn't work out for me. I'm going to legitimize you, but like it keeps not working out. And so Samuel is like, well, I mean, like, the people want a king. God has told me I need to anoint a king. So if it's not working out with this guy, I failed yet again in my prophetic task. Let me go and find another, right? So he tells Saul already in chapter 13, 1 Samuel chapter 13, that, this isn't working out. You're really not very good at this. There's been another who's anointed. And things carry on for a couple more chapters until Saul, through the prophet Samuel, is told, you need to go take the fight to the Amalekites for what they did to us during the time of the Exodus. And so Saul goes, and he vanquishes them. And he wipes out a great number of them, but he does what kings do. He captures their king to hold for ransom, smart move, and he brings back a whole bunch of loot, right? Well, if you're holding a king for ransom, that probably means you didn't actually wipe everybody out. Who's going to pay the ransom, right? So he doesn't actually do what he's been told to do. Now, this is like, for modern minds like ourselves, we might say, good job, Sam. Good job, Saul. Probably would be worse, maybe, if you wiped out everybody. So thank you for not doing that. But nevertheless, it seems like whatever has gone wrong here, Saul has just not done what he's supposed to do. And for Samuel, this is the last straw. And he confronts Saul and says, no, that's it. You're done. You're going to have the kingdom taken away from you. And so then Samuel's distressed. He's in quite the mood, and he's moping around. And God comes to him in the very next chapter and says, well, are you going to just be mad that it didn't work out for you and it's not working out for your successor, or are you going to go do something about it? So he gets sent to find King David. And so he goes, he anoints David. But this is really, really key here, this transition of what's going on. The Lord said to Samuel, "How long will you grieve over Saul? I have rejected him from being king over Israel. Fill your horn with oil. I will send you to Jesse the Bethlehemite, for I have provided for myself a king among his sons." So a few verses later in chapter 16, he sent and brought him in. So he's gone through all the sons, right? And none of them are working out. So they go send for the last one. Now he was ruddy, he was red, and he was beautiful. He had beautiful eyes and was handsome. The Lord said, "Rise and anoint him, for this is the one." Then Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the presence of his brothers, and the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon David from that day forward. Samuel then set out and went to Ramah. Now, in our passage for today, 2 Samuel chapter 5, in verse 2, we heard a very curious thing. For some time, while Saul was king over us, it was you, David, who led out Israel and brought it in. The Lord said to you, "It is you who shall be shepherd of my people Israel, you who shall be ruler over Israel." Now, where did God actually say this to David? This is a great mystery. This wording shows up in two places. It shows up here, and it shows up in Chronicles, where it has this passage verbatim. But it doesn't show up anywhere else in the book of Samuel. So I went looking, and I was trying to figure out, where does God actually say this to David? That David's going to be the shepherd, going to be the ruler. It never actually happens. There's just these two places where something like it occurs. And one is where Samuel comes and anoints him. But he never actually addresses David, right? Neither the Lord nor Samuel actually say anything to David. All that happens is the Lord said, "Rise and anoint him, for this is the one." And then we get this kind of description that the Lord came upon David mightily, and this kind of then leads into this narrative rise of David in the book of Samuel, right? He starts playing his little harp for the court, and he starts weaseling his way into this and that, and finally breaks onto the scene as quite the warrior, and all these things, right? But you never actually get God saying anything to David, which is curious, because when David starts acting as a military commander, God is speaking to him all the time. You get all these little exchanges where God kind of specifically says, like, no, go around those trees this way. David consulted the Lord, and the Lord said, do this, right? So in battle, God is constantly communicating, or at least according to the text, God is constantly communicating to David in this very kind of like minute way. And yet, when it comes to his actual anointing and his actual promise that he's going to be king, that's not there. And that is weird. So where are the people getting this from? There's one other relevant passage. And this comes a bit later. So after Samuel dies, David looks around, and he's kind of like, he's been, slowly chiseling away at Saul's authority, gaining more prestige for himself. He's the celebrated battle commander. He's the key to all of Israel's success. The people are starting to sing things like, Saul has killed his thousands, but David his tens of thousands, right? So there's starting to be this popular sentiment around David, and he knows that, well, because Saul has tried to kill him multiple times already by throwing spears at him, he knows that, things are a little precarious for him in the court. So he goes, all right, Samuel's dead. He dies. And everybody mourns him at the start of chapter 25. Samuel died. All Israel assembled and mourned for him. And they buried him at his home in Ramah. The last kind of power broker that's not Saul is gone, and his kind of protector is gone. So David figures it's going to be for the best if he kind of puts some distance between himself and Saul. So he heads south. He heads south into Judah. And there's a theory. If you read through the book of Samuel really carefully, and you go back to Joshua and kind of read it carefully too, there's a theory that biblical scholars kind of like argue about how exactly the land of promise was conquered. So the dominant story follows Joshua, right? And you get the crossing of the Jordan and then the kind of the conquest. And through the book of Joshua, you hear how they kind of went around and conquered all these little city-states, essentially. But there are hints every so often that actually there were two invasions. And the reason for this, the reason that this theory exists is because if you remember when Moses sent the 12 spies into Israel, 10 were bad and 2 were good. Who are the 2? Caleb and Joshua, right? There is a theory that Caleb actually comes up from the south and conquers what becomes the southern kingdom of Judah. And then Joshua comes around across the Jordan from the east and kind of conquers the north. And so this long-standing divide in Israel's kind of geopolitics between a southern kingdom and a northern kingdom reflects this early pattern of conquest. And you see a little bit of that here in how David goes about taking power. He escapes down south into Judah, and he kind of starts to make a stronghold for himself with Nabal, the Calebite. And Nabal is like kind of not a very good dude. They have a bit of a falling out. But then at the end of it, in chapter 25, Nabal's wife says something really curious to David. She says, "And it shall come to pass, when the Lord shall have done to my Lord according to all the good that he has spoken concerning you, and shall have appointed you ruler over Israel." Here, out of Abigail's mouth, we get something that becomes quite close to the confession that we will eventually hear in 2 Samuel 5 from all of Israel. But it's coming first from the wife of one of these lords of Judah. And there's a later on, as David consolidates power, you'll recall that Eli, his sons, have lost the ark, right? And it's at a certain point that ark makes its way back into Israelite territory, but never kind of quite gets back to the center of their cultic activity. It doesn't get back to Shiloh, or it doesn't get back to where else? Ramah, or Hebron, Jerusalem. Now, none of these important sites where they're kind of the political and the cultic overlap. It ends up at this place called Kiriath Jearim. And Kiriath Jearim has another name that just pops up occasionally, which is Baal Judah, the lords of Judah. It seems to be a place of kind of like political power for the Judahite lords. And so you see already what like David is doing is this very kind of strategic maneuvering to start building a power base for himself amongst the lords of Judah, who are already kind of feeling themselves as something kind of separate from the rest of Israel. Eventually, not even this strategy is going to work out for him. Things get too hot, even in the south, so he takes off to be amongst the Philistines, because they're the big power. They're the big military power, right? And this is where you get the little note about the no blacksmiths thing, because Saul's continuing to fight them, and then you find out, like, wait, they're not letting you fight with weapons? What's going on? Like, so, much like, I was just talking to a Zimbabwean friend of mine, and during the time of Robert Mugabe, one of his top generals, known as the Crocodile, kind of fell out of favor with Mugabe, and so he took off to China to kind of like be there in exile, and he said, I'll be back. And now he's president. But there is this kind of thing, right, where a dissident who's maybe a top general, this is a well-known thing. We still see this today. They will sometimes need to leave because things become politically untenable for them, with a kind of a promise that they'll be back. So when David is amongst the Philistines, he doesn't waste his time. He curries favor with the Philistines by convincing them that he is attacking Israel and Judah, but actually he's going and systematically eliminating other threats, right? Other nations that surround Israel. And when he goes in, he exterminates them completely so that nobody can come and tell tales. So he's growing his power base, and he's kind of like growing power for Israel, or by eliminating threats to them, and then bringing the treasure back and saying to the Philistines, look at all these Israelites that I've killed. So they think that they have this great ally in David. Not so much. And some of the commanders don't really trust. So when the Philistines finally come to kind of put an end to Saul, David starts marching with them. And the king is like, yeah, this is great. He's very trusted. He's proven himself. The other commanders are like, I don't know, like, they're still singing songs about this guy in Israel. Are we sure, like, we want to bring him into battle with us? This seems like a bad idea. So the king is forced to send him back. And here David finally sees his opportunity. The Philistine armies are gone. The Israelite armies are occupied in this. Now is his time to go wipe out the Amalekites, to go do what Saul was supposed to do. So he goes and he does that. He wipes out the Amalekites, kind of, except he does the same thing that Saul does. He brings back all the loot that was supposed to be cherem, right? It's supposed to be utterly devoted to the Lord. He doesn't do that. He brings that back, and what does he do with it? He ends up bribing all the lords of Judah, and this is how he gets established as king at Hebron. So the lords of Judah come and they make him their king. And there, David will reign for 7 years, consolidating power in the south, as they begin to launch this civil war against what's left of the house of Saul. And we hear that this war goes on and on until Israel just cannot maintain it anymore. And it is the people who come. And they make David their king. And it's upon the public, the kind of the mass public making this proclamation that then the elders, the kind of the lords of Israel, they're kind of forced to be like, all right, well, the people are on his side. Like, what are we going to do? We have to make him king. I think this is part of how we need to understand what's going on in 2 Samuel 5, verse 2. While there's this theological gloss that we could maybe point to Abigail or Samuel as being kind of the roots of where the people are getting this idea that he's God's anointed, that God said these things to him, I think what's more important is the first half of the verse, that they're pointing to his effectiveness as a battle commander. That finally here is a guy, after Eli and his sons haven't worked out. Samuel and his sons haven't worked out. Saul and his sons haven't worked out. Now finally David is the one who's actually managed to have some serious victories against their surrounding enemies. And so whether you read this as like imperial propaganda on the part of David or as something more real, theologically, this is the union of Israel's commitment that God is the one who always provides victory in battle with their desire for a king to kind of like have a just in case. So now finally they can kind of like synthesize realpolitik with their kind of theological commitments. And so it becomes the case that now Israel is going to say that David is the Lord's anointed and that he has God's blessing upon him because this kind of success in their history has only ever come when God fights on their behalf. So because David's having all the success, never mind that he's quite a strategic commander and quite a strategic tactician, it just must be the case that God's on his side. This is the kind of the synthesis. But this will break down, and this will break down quickly. As soon as David secures his reign, he starts having issues with his children, most notably Absalom. His firstborn son, he rises up in opposition to David. And there's a bloody civil war that occurs. And we find out that in the battle that ultimately decides between the armies of Absalom and the armies of David, that 20,000 people die. David does end up securing his reign, but this is like a pretty Pyrrhic victory for him. Yet we also get a really curious little verse here. 2 Samuel 18:8. We read that the forest claimed more victims that day than the sword. It's not actually the war that ends up determining this thing. It's the land itself. There is this kind of underlying principle in the covenant relationship between Israel and God that the land is a third party to it, and that the land can be polluted by the violence of Israel. And when the land is sufficiently polluted by this violence, it hits back. And we're starting to see this already here. Ultimately, I said that the book of Samuel is asking this question about kingship. Are we going to commit to kings or not? They end up committing to kings. But the overarching question that the entirety of the former prophets is asking is, how did we end up in exile in Babylon? How did we end up kicked out of the land? Already here, at the culmination of David's power and his kind of consolidation of that, we're starting to see the land is starting to say, whoa, this is too much. This is too much violence. They've swallowed up the most kills here. And ultimately, the violence of the kings is going to continue to escalate, right? King after king after king. We see more and more violence, more and more worship of idols, more and more general disobedience to the law of God. And what happens? The land spits them out. It's not the case that God is punishing them for disobedience. God is, or abandoning them, right? They feel like God has abandoned them, forsaken them. But God comes with them into exile. This is the story that continues, right? God goes, departs from the temple, follows them out into wherever they've been dispersed to, and comes back with them. Eventually will bring them back to the land. But the land itself needs rest. And the time that they're going to be out of the land is the amount of years that they skipped observing Sabbath years and Jubilee years, and all of the rest that the land cries out for that was overrode by this violent kingship, right? And already at the start, we get this little hint that the land is not happy with the choice that the people have made. It's the small protest voice against the decision that the people have made and that God has reluctantly agreed to in God's commitment to always be their God as they are their people. I've said that to understand the book of Samuel, we have to understand it as prophetic literature. In the book of Deuteronomy, I think it's the book of Deuteronomy, within the law, there's this principle that to identify a prophet, there has to be kind of a horizon to the prophetic interpretation in which the people will see that come to pass. But we continue as Christians to receive this as prophetic literature. And the reason for that is because canonically, we think that ultimately the horizon of this stuff is Christ. That the kind of the ultimate in God's promise to his people, that I will be your God and you will be my people, is shown to us in the God who is for us in Jesus Christ. Now, there's a lot of really sloppy exegetical moves that get made here, where Jesus just is kind of a type of King David. And the Gospels give us all sorts of opportunities to make this move, right? Because it's very clear that Jesus kind of comes to us through the line of Judah, through the line of David, is born in David's city, all these kinds of things. But it would be a mistake to see Jesus as kind of typifying this kind of violent, strategic, scheming kingship that David exhibits. There's another side of David, and this is the side of David that is utterly crushed and humiliated later on in his life, as kind of everything falls off, right? His sons die, his country is put under plague as judgment for what he does with the whole Uriah and Bathsheba incident. Kind of thing after thing collapses on him until he's kind of old and impotent, and not even the warmth of a young woman can keep him warm anymore, right? And then, he still hardens his heart, even there on his deathbed. There's this incredibly chilling Game of Thrones-esque scene where he hands over power to Solomon and said, yeah, I made commitments to not punish all these people that offended me, but if you know what's good for you, you won't let the sun go down on them. And he gives them a hit list, right? So the kind of, the real politicking, the kind of, the realism of political kingship is right there in David all the time. But also there's this like humiliation. And there's this sense that, well, even in spite of David doing all of these things, God has determined by grace to be for God's people and is going to try and provide some sort of future for his people, even through this person. And what you see, I think, the prophetic move from David here to Christ is that Christ actually exhibits this kingship precisely in its inversion. That through the gentleness, humiliation, and execution of Christ at the hands of these real politicking powers, right? Pilate doesn't really want to deal with yet another issue among the Jews. And it's just like, oh, fine, kill him then. Like, I don't care. There's a kind of a casualness to the execution of Christ. A casualness that comes from this is just how power gets exercised. And yet it is right in that crucifixion, in that humiliation, that we come to know that Christ's name is the name that is above every name. That this is the King of Kings, the one who is the firstborn of all creation, who is properly the heir of the line of David. David is raised to the highest of heights and later brought to the very depths of his humility. Jesus' lordship is held in the perfection of this paradox. It is in the lowly humiliation of the cross that his name is that which is above every name, and through it all we discover God's abounding faithfulness to God's people. That God has determined to be the God who is for the world, and that this world and all of its people will be God's forever. Amen.